The morning Celia Hawthorne climbed onto the roof of the Millhaven schoolhouse with nothing but a borrowed ladder, a canvas bag of nails, and a jaw set harder than the October wind. The whole town of Millhaven, Kansas, watched from behind curtained windows and said nothing at all. That was the way of things in 1882. A widow did not ask for help. A widow worked until her hands bled, smiled when the preacher offered prayers she did not need, and kept her grief pressed so flat and tight inside her chest that some mornings she forgot it was there, until she breathed too deep. Celia had been doing exactly that for 14 months, ever since the fever took Thomas Hawthorne in the August of the year before, leaving her with 40 acres of dry farmland, a mule named Pepper, $300 in a tin beneath the floorboards, and a teaching post at the Millhaven schoolhouse that paid $22 a month. $22 a month was enough to keep her fed. It was not enough to hire Elias Croft, the town's only carpenter, who had quoted her $4.50 to fix the section of roof above the back corner, where the wooden shingles had peeled away in a summer storm and left a gap the size of a saddle blanket. $4.50 was 2 weeks of groceries. It was new boots for winter. It was the difference between a lean season and a dangerous one. And so Celia had thanked Elias Croft, walked out of his workshop, bought a bundle of cedar shingles from the general store for 62 cents, borrowed the ladder from her nearest neighbor Agnes Pratt, and decided she would fix it herself. She had never been on a roof in her life. But Thomas had, many times, and she had watched him, and she had the good sense to know that fear was something you could tuck behind your teeth when the job required it. The first morning she hauled the ladder against the side wall of the schoolhouse and stood at the bottom looking up. She allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of hesitation. Then she picked up the canvas bag and she climbed. The roof was steeper than it had looked from the ground, and the October wind came off the prairie in long, cold pushes that made the rungs of the ladder sing. She moved carefully, keeping her weight low, her fingers tight on the ridge of the roof when she reached the top. Below her, Millhaven spread out in the pale morning light like a handful of matchsticks dropped in the dirt, the dry goods store, the post office, the church, the livery, the small houses with their smoke curling up into a gray sky. She could see Agnes Pratt's washing line from up here. She could see the road that ran south toward Dodge City 20 miles away. She turned her back on all of it and faced the damaged section. The gap was worse than she had thought. 3 shingles had come away entirely, and 2 more were cracked through the middle and lifting at their edges in the wind. Beneath them the tar paper was split, and she could see the pale interior wood of the decking beneath, darkened already at one edge with moisture staining. If she did not get this fixed before the October rains came in earnest, that staining would become rot, and rot would spread. And by spring, the entire back corner of the schoolhouse would need replacing at a cost she could not begin to imagine. She began pulling the cracked shingles free, prying them up with the flat end of her hammer. The work was awkward at first because the pitch of the roof kept wanting to slide her sideways, and she had to wedge her left boot against the ridge board and lean into the work like she was fighting it. Her hands were cold. She had not brought gloves because she had forgotten gloves, and she refused to climb down and walk home for them when the sky was already threatening. The nails in the old shingles were stubborn, rusted deep into the wood, and by the time she had all the damaged pieces free, her fingers were raw and her right shoulder ached from the pulling. She sat back on her heels for a moment, breathing the cold air, and looked at what she had done. A gap approximately 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep stared back at her. She could see the interior of the schoolroom through it, the row of small wooden desks, the chalkboard at the front, the potbelly stove that was not yet lit because the school was not in session this week on account of the harvest days closing when half the families took their children to help in the fields. She had until Monday to fix this before 22 children filed back in and the first rain of the real autumn season found that hole. Today was Thursday. She was not worried. She had 4 days. She began fitting the new shingles. The work went slowly, but it went. She found a rhythm after the first hour, the hammer falling in steady strokes, the cedar splitting sharp and clean under the nails. Her shoulder stopped aching once it warmed up. She worked across the gap from left to right, overlapping each course the way she had watched Thomas do it on the barn 2 summers ago, pressing each shingle tight against the one before it, driving 2 nails near the top where the next course would cover them. It was satisfying work, the kind that showed itself immediately, the kind where you could look back at the last half hour and see exactly what you had accomplished. By midday, she had the tar paper retacked and the first 2 courses of shingles laid. She climbed down, ate the biscuit she had wrapped in a cloth and left in the canvas bag, drank water from the tin canteen she had hung on a nail of the ladder and looked up at what remained. 3 more courses, maybe 4. She could finish tomorrow. She went back up. The afternoon light was lower and colder, and the wind picked up as the sun moved west, and her hands had gone from raw to genuinely sore by the time she reached the 3rd course. She was 2 shingles from the end of it when the hammer slipped in her grip, turned sideways, and struck her left thumb instead of the nail head. The pain was immediate and bright, and she pressed her thumb against her thigh and breathed through her teeth and said one word quietly that Thomas would have been surprised to hear her say. Then she looked at her thumb. It was not broken. It was already purpling at the base of the nail. It would be stiff tomorrow. She finished the 2 shingles. She climbed down in the early dusk light, gathered her tools, and walked home to her farmhouse at the edge of town, where Pepper the mule stood at the fence looking at her with the particular expression of judgment that mules seem to perfect. She fed him, fed herself from the pot of beans she had left slow cooking on the stove, and sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight with her sore hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, looking at nothing in particular. The house was very quiet. It was always very quiet. That was not something she thought about anymore, or tried not to. But on evenings like this one, when her body was tired and the dark came in at the windows and there was no other voice anywhere to fill the room, the quietness had a particular weight to it that she felt along the length of her spine. She washed her face, wrapped her thumb in a strip of clean cotton, and went to bed. She was back at the schoolhouse ladder at first light Friday morning. The 4th course went on faster because her hands had remembered the work, and because she had thought through the technique the night before while lying in the dark, tracing the roof in her mind, planning the angle of each nail. She was halfway through it when she heard boots on the hard-packed earth below her, unhurried boots, not rushing, not announcing themselves particularly, just arriving. She did not look down immediately. She drove the nail she was setting, then sat back on her heels and looked over her shoulder. He was standing at the base of the ladder with a hammer in his hand. He was perhaps 32 or 33, broad in the shoulders the way men get from actual labor rather than posturing, with dark hair going slightly long under a worn brown felt hat and a jaw that needed a shave. He wore a canvas work coat, faded to a pale tan at the seams, and boots that had been resoled at least once. He was not someone she recognized, which meant he was not from Millhaven proper, though there was something in the easy way he stood that said he was not a stranger to places like it. He looked up at her with calm dark eyes and said, "I thought you might need a second hammer." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the hammer in his hand. It was a good one, heavier than hers, with a worn hickory handle that had the patina of long use. "I am managing perfectly well," she said. "I can see that," he said, and his voice carried no argument in it, only acknowledgement. He did not leave. She turned back to her work. She drove 3 more nails. She could feel him still standing there below her, and it did not unsettle her exactly, but it was a presence, warm and solid, in a way she was not accustomed to noticing anymore. "Who are you?" she asked without turning around. "Arthur Ashford," he said. "I rode in yesterday evening. I am taking a look at the Heller property on the South Road. Widow Heller is my aunt by marriage." She knew Widow Heller. Everyone knew Widow Heller, a sharp-tongued woman of 60 who had been trying to sell her 30 acres for 2 years. She turned enough to see him again. "You ride in from Dodge?" she asked. "From Wichita originally," he said. "I have been working a spread near Caldwell for the past year. A cowboy then, or had been." She could see it now in the particular stillness of him, the kind of stillness that men develop when they have spent long stretches in open country where noise and quick movement can cause problems. "The schoolhouse belongs to this town," she said. "The roof is my responsibility because I am the teacher and no one else was fixing it." "I understand that," he said. He did not offer excuses or arguments. He just looked up at her, patient, with the hammer at his side. She studied him for a moment longer. Then she said, "If you intend to come up, watch the third rung from the top. It flexes." She heard him test the ladder, heard the careful placement of his weight, and then he was on the roof beside her, lowering himself to the pitch in the easy, practiced way of someone who had worked from heights before, perhaps on barn roofs, perhaps on ranch buildings in the open country. He looked at what she had done and looked at what remained, and he did not say anything about either. He simply shifted to the far end of the gap and began fitting a shingle to the unfinished section. She watched him for just a moment. He was doing it correctly. The overlap was right. The nail placement was right. She went back to her own section. They worked in silence for a while, the two hammers falling in an irregular counterpoint that she found, to her own slight surprise, not unpleasant. The morning light strengthened around them, and the wind had dropped since yesterday, which made the work easier and the cold more bearable. She could hear the town beginning its day below them, the distant clang from the blacksmith 2 streets over, someone's dog barking at the edge of things, a wagon on the main road. "How long has the gap been there?" he asked, after perhaps 20 minutes. "Since July," she said. "Storm came through. Anyone from the town board offered to have it repaired." She glanced at him. "The town board offered a great deal of opinions about it," she said. "What they did not offer was money." He made a quiet sound that she thought might have been the beginning of a laugh, but if it was, he kept it contained. He drove 2 more nails. "Elias Croft would have charged me $4.50, she said, not sure why she was explaining this to a stranger, and yet finding that she was. "That is almost 2 weeks of groceries." "Elias Croft charges $4.50 for everything," Arthur said. "He charged my aunt $3 to fix a hinge." She did actually laugh at that, a short and surprised sound that came out before she could decide whether to allow it. She felt the warmth of it in her chest, and then felt briefly strange about the warmth, and then decided that laughing at a reasonable joke about a man who overcharged for hinge repairs was not a significant moral failing. "The school is closed this week," she said. "For the harvest," he said. "Students come back Monday. I want to be done before Sunday." "You will be done today at this rate," he said. He was already on the 5th course, one ahead of her. She drove her hammer a little faster. They finished the patching by midday. The last course fit snug along the ridge, each shingle lapped tight over the one below, the nails set clean. She ran her palm over the new cedar and felt the solid evenness of it, felt the satisfaction that she had been working toward for 2 days. The gap was gone. The roof was whole. She sat back and looked at the horizon, which was wide and flat and the color of a blue-gray slate in the October midday light, and felt something unclench in her chest. "Good work," Arthur Ashford said, from 2 feet away on the same ridge. "Thank you," she said, and she meant for the help too, though she did not say that part directly. He was looking at the same horizon she was, and there was something easy about the way he did it, something unhurried, as if a man could sit on a rooftop in the middle of October and look at a Kansas prairie and find it sufficient. She had not been around a man who seemed comfortable in his own stillness in a long time. Thomas had always needed to be doing something, always reaching for the next task, which she had loved about him, but which had also meant that their silences had always been in motion. "How long have you been here?" Arthur asked. "In Millhaven." 6 years, she said. "I came with my husband from Illinois. He had family here." "And the teaching post?" 3 years. They needed a teacher when the previous one left to get married." She paused. "The assumption being, I suppose, that a married woman would not stay in the post. I did. He looked at her then, a direct and interested look without any of the complicated pity she had grown to dread from people who knew her story. He had not yet made the connection, she realized. He did not know she was a widow. He had seen a woman fixing a roof alone and offered a hammer, and that was all he knew about her. She was not sure why the thought of that was refreshing. "I am a widow," she said, partly because it was better for him to know it directly than to learn it later from Agnes Pratt. 14 months now. The fever. He held her gaze. "I am sorry," he said. It was simple and he meant it. She could hear that he meant it, and that was all he said about it. "Thank you," she said. They climbed down. At the bottom she took the ladder while he gathered the remaining shingles and the canvas bag. She noticed that he handled the borrowed things with care, checking that the nails had not scattered, counting the unused cedar pieces and stacking them neatly. A man who looked after tools that were not his was a man worth noting. She told herself she was noticing it as a matter of general practicality. "I will be at my aunt's property for the rest of the week," he said, setting the shingle stack against the schoolhouse wall. "If you need help with anything else." "I do not anticipate needing help with anything else," she said. He took his hat off briefly, the way men did when they were acknowledging something they intended to respect, and then put it back and walked toward the south road. She watched him for perhaps 2 seconds longer than was necessary, and then she did not watch him at all, and she took the ladder back to Agnes Pratt and went home and made a proper dinner for the first time in 3 days, because she was no longer spending the evening worrying about the roof. Agnes Pratt came by the following morning, Saturday, which she always did, because Agnes Pratt was the closest thing to a friend that Millhaven had given Celia, and their Saturday morning habit of coffee and complaint had been one of the anchor points of Celia's week since Thomas died. Agnes was 51, the widow of a postal worker, with the permanently raised eyebrow of someone who had seen enough of life to find most of it predictable and most people's pretensions amusing. She sat down at Celia's kitchen table and wrapped both hands around her mug and said, "I heard you had company on the schoolhouse roof yesterday." "Word travels fast in a small town," Celia said. Edith Crandall saw from her window. She described him as a very well-built young man, which from Edith is practically a written proposal. Agnes's eyebrow climbed. "Who is he?" "Arthur Ashford, Widow Heller's nephew by marriage." He offered a second hammer and I accepted it because the roof needed finishing and there was no practical reason to refuse. She poured her own coffee and sat down. He knew what he was doing with shingles. "Did he?" Agnes said, in a tone that contained considerably more meaning than the words. "Agnes, I am merely confirming facts. He rode in from Caldwell. He is here to look at the property." Celia set her mug down. "That is the end of the story." Agnes gave her the particular look she reserved for statements she found optimistic. "Henrietta Heller has been trying to sell that property for 2 years. Nobody stays long enough to decide whether they want 30 acres of not very good soil on the South Road, except," she paused. "A nephew, you said, by marriage." "That is what he said. Henrietta's husband's family was from Abilene, the Ashfords." Agnes's expression shifted slightly. "I believe there was a son who went to work the cattle drives when he was young, came back a few years ago and then went on again. Something about a wife who did not wait." She said it carefully, watching Celia's face. Celia kept her face neutral, though she catalogued the information with the precise efficiency of a woman who had learned to make careful assessments of the world she lived in. A man who had been through something of his own then. That explained the quiet in him, the lack of bluster. Men who had not been tested tended to fill silences with noise. Men who had been tested either broke or they learned to be still. "He fixed the roof," she said. "I will probably not see him again." This turned out to be incorrect. Sunday afternoon, she was in the churchyard after the service, speaking with Reverend Munn about the upcoming school term, and whether the church might donate a second reader to replace the one whose spine had given out, when she heard the creak of wagon wheels on the road and looked up to see Arthur Ashford driving a buckboard past. headed north toward the main street, with a length of timber in the bed that suggested some kind of repair work at the Heller property. He glanced toward the churchyard, and their eyes met for the brief moment that constitutes noticing, and he nodded once, the same gesture he might have given anyone, and drove on. She found her attention returning to that small nod for the remainder of the afternoon in a way that she found mildly irritating. Monday she was at the schoolhouse at 7:30, lighting the potbelly stove to warm the room before the students arrived. She stood in the back corner and looked up at the ceiling where the roof damage had been and could see nothing. Solid and dry. She ran her thumb over the old bruised nail and thought about the even counterpoint of two hammers in the cold October air. She put both thoughts aside and turned to the chalkboard. The students arrived in their usual cascade. The three Hennessy boys racing each other through the door, little Dory Caldwell with her braids and her persistent cough, the Morrison twins who were never in agreement about anything including which desk was theirs, and all the others, 17 in total this week, 3 families still occupied with the last of the harvest. She took attendance, opened the reading primer, and the room filled with the particular energy of 20 young minds turning reluctantly from open fields back toward conjugation and multiplication. She loved it. She had always loved it. The way a room full of children asking questions was an argument against despair so complete it required no defending. Thomas had said once that she was the best teacher he had ever seen because she genuinely liked the students, even the difficult ones. Especially the difficult ones. At noon, she let them out to the yard and stood in the doorway watching them run, and felt the good ordinary weight of her daily life settle back around her like a familiar coat. She did not think about Arthur Ashford at all through the school day. She thought about him that evening briefly, while she was grading the morning's arithmetic work, and she tried to examine the thinking honestly, the way she examined most things, without sentiment or deflection. He had been kind in a specific way, not the performed kindness of men who were trying to impress or manage her, not the soft-handed pity of men who saw a widow and saw helplessness. He had offered a practical thing, a hammer, because there was practical work being done. He had worked without making the help into a statement about her inadequacy. He had not asked anything of her in return. She was not in the habit of cataloging the qualities of men. She was also not, she admitted to herself with some firmness, made of stone. She put the arithmetic papers away and went to bed. She saw him on Tuesday at the general store. She was buying flour and lamp oil when he came in for nails and a length of chain for what she gathered from his exchange with Mr. Butterworth, the proprietor, was a broken gate at the Heller property. She was at the counter and he waited behind her, and she turned when Butterworth went to the back for the lamp oil and found herself closer to Arthur Ashford than she had been since the roof. "How did the roof hold?" he asked. Not "how are you," not the empty social opening. The roof. The thing they had actually worked on together. "Perfectly," she said. "I checked it this morning." "Good cedar," he said. "The shingles were a sound choice." "They were 62 cents," she said, "as opposed to $4.50. This time he did smile, a proper one, not contained, and it did something specific to the quality of his face, made it younger and warmer, and she thought again that he was probably 32 or 33, and that 14 months was not actually a very long time when you laid it against the whole of a life. "How is the Heller property?" she asked, because it was a natural question. "Better than I expected in some ways," he said. "Worse in others. The soil on the south field is good. The well is strong. The main house needs considerable work." He paused. "I am trying to decide if it is the kind of considerable that becomes its own argument against the purchase or the kind that is simply honest labor." "What is the difference?" she asked, genuinely curious. He thought about it, which she noticed, that he actually thought about the question rather than giving the first answer that came to him. "The first kind is the kind where the problems are in the bones," he said. "Foundation, structure, the kind you cannot fix no matter how much work you put in. The second kind is the kind where the surface is bad but the bones are sound. That kind you can fix with enough time and the right intentions. She thought he might be talking about more than a house. She was not certain enough of that to say so. Butterworth came back with her lamp oil. She paid and gathered her purchases and said goodbye to Arthur Ashford with the simple courtesy she extended to everyone, and walked home in the October afternoon that smelled of dried grass and coming rain, and thought about what he had said about bones that were sound. It rained Wednesday night. A hard, driving autumn rain that came in off the prairie in sheets and hammered the farmhouse roof and rattled the windows in their frames. She lay in the dark listening to it and thought about the schoolhouse, about the new shingles, about the neat row of cedar laid against the ridge. In the morning she walked to the schoolhouse in the early light and went to the back corner and looked up. Not a drop. She stood there for a moment with her hands clasped in front of her and felt the warmth of a thing done right. She was at the schoolhouse front door when she heard boots on the road and turned to see Arthur Ashford coming up the street, hatless in the aftermath of the rain, his dark hair slightly damp, carrying what appeared to be a jar of something preserved. He stopped when he saw her and looked briefly surprised, or not surprised exactly, but as if he had caught himself doing something he was not entirely sure how to explain. He held up the jar. "My aunt," he said. "She sent plum preserves. She heard from Agnes Pratt that you had been up fixing the school roof, and she considers that the kind of thing that deserves plum preserves." Celia looked at the jar and then looked at him and said, "Did she also send you to deliver them, or did you come yourself?" A pause, not a long one but honest. "Both," he said. She held the door open. "Come in then." He followed her inside. It was the first time he had been in the schoolhouse properly, from the look of it. She watched him look at the room, the small desks, the chalkboard with its morning lesson still written out, the reading primer propped on the teacher's stand. He looked at all of it with the same careful attention he had given to the roof, as if the room was a thing worth understanding. "How many students?" he asked. 22 enrolled. 17 present most days." She took the plum preserves from him and set them on her desk. "Please thank Widow Heller for me. Henrietta will want a full report," he said dryly. "She is particularly interested in whether the roof held through the rain." "You can tell her it held perfectly." He nodded. He stood there in the schoolroom with the morning light coming in the south windows and landing on the row of empty desks, and she had the sudden strong sense of him as a man standing in a space he wished were his, not the schoolroom specifically but the settled, purposeful quality of it, the way a room that is being used for something good carries that goodness in its walls. "Are you going to buy the property?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "I am trying to decide. What is stopping you?" "The honest answer is that I am not certain what I am buying it for," he said. A man should know what he is building toward before he puts his name on a deed. It was more candid than she had expected. She looked at him for a moment, at the earnestness of it, the lack of performance. "The bones are sound?" she asked. His expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "Yes," he said, "I believe they are." The students began arriving at 8:30, and she was at the door to receive them, and Arthur Ashford was gone by the time they all filed in. But the jar of plum preserves sat on her desk all day, and she thought about the way he had said both, simply and without pretense, when she had asked whether Widow Heller had sent him or whether he had come himself. Agnes Pratt confirmed on Saturday that Henrietta Heller had indeed sent the preserves, had in fact been quite insistent about it, but had also confirmed with barely contained satisfaction that it had taken Arthur Ashford approximately 2 additional minutes of conversation before he had volunteered to deliver them. Agnes had this information from Henrietta directly, who had offered it to Agnes with the specific relish of a woman who had reached the age where she felt entirely entitled to orchestrate things. "She likes him," Agnes said, of Widow Heller's investment in the situation. "She has always liked him. He is her late husband's sister's boy, and she says he has been drifting since that woman left him, and she would very much like to see him stop drifting." "I am not in the business of stopping men from drifting," Celia said. "No," Agnes said calmly, "but you are in the business of teaching, and of fixing roofs that need fixing, and of making do in ways that most people in this town are too comfortable to try. And a man who shows up with a second hammer and does not need to be told how to use it is not the same as the other kind." Celia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He said he is not sure what he is building toward." Agnes turned her mug in her hands. "Then perhaps he needs to understand what good things already exist in this town before he can answer that question." Thursday of the following week, the Harvest Days celebration came to Millhaven, which meant that the main street was strung with lanterns, and the livery lot was cleared for dancing, and every family within 10 miles came into town with their wagons and their best clothes and their opinions about whose preserves had won the ribbon at the judging table. It was the kind of event that the frontier towns built carefully and tended jealously because out here, 60 miles from the nearest city, community was not an abstraction. It was the literal difference between surviving a hard winter and not. Celia wore her good dress, the dark blue wool one that had been her best for 3 years now and was still the best she owned, and walked to the main street with Agnes at her side. She was not looking for Arthur Ashford. She told herself this with full sincerity, and found him within 10 minutes, standing at the edge of the cleared lot with Widow Heller on his arm, the old woman dressed with the careful effort of someone who still considered public occasions worth the trouble. He caught Celia's eye across the crowd, and there was a moment, just a clean and specific moment, in which the noise and movement of the whole gathering seemed to thin to nothing, and it was only the two of them looking at each other across 20 feet of packed earth. Then someone's child ran between them and the moment ended, but it had been there. Widow Heller made her way to Celia with the purposeful energy of a small woman who has decided something and means to accomplish it, pulling Arthur along in her wake. "Celia Hawthorne," Henrietta Heller said, gripping both Celia's hands with her dry, warm ones. "I hear that roof is fixed perfectly, and I am entirely satisfied with the report. This is my Arthur. We have met," Arthur said, and looked at Celia with quiet amusement. "I know you have met. I arranged it," Henrietta said, without any apology for the confession. "Now I would like some of that apple cider before my feet give out on me. Agnes, come with me and tell me what you know about the Morrison family's ridiculous dispute over the fence line, because I have thoughts." And Agnes, who was clearly in on the whole arrangement judging by the serenity of her expression, took Henrietta's other arm and led her away with a precision that was nearly theatrical. Celia and Arthur stood side by side at the edge of the dancing lot in the lantern light. The fiddle player was warming up, joined now by a man with a banjo, and couples were moving to the center of the cleared space with the tentative joy of people who had been working hard for months and were ready to stop for an evening. "Your aunt," Celia said. "I know," he said. "She is very straightforward." "She is the most direct person I have ever met," he said, with the fond exasperation of long acquaintance. "She told me the morning after I arrived that she hoped I would find a reason to stay." Celia looked at the dancers. "And have you?" she asked. She meant it as a light question, and it came out as something more honest than that, and she did not take it back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I might be beginning to." They did not dance that first evening. They walked the edge of the lot and talked properly at length, in the way that you talk with someone when the conversation has a current in it that carries you forward without effort. She told him about Thomas, not the grief of it, or not only that, but the person of him, the way he had made her laugh, the way he had been genuinely proud of her teaching in a time when not all men were. She told him about Illinois, about the journey west, about the way her first sight of the Kansas prairie had been nothing like she expected, and then had become the most beautiful landscape she had ever known. He told her about Wichita, where he had grown up the second of 4 brothers in a family that was not poor but was not comfortable. He told her about the cattle drives when he was 19, 20, 21, the long seasons on the trail that had taught him patience and landscape, and the particular value of reliability in other people. He told her carefully about the woman he had married at 24, a woman from Abilene who had found the life he offered too spare and too uncertain, and had left when he was away on a drive, taking nothing that was not hers to take and leaving nothing that was not his to keep. "I do not blame her," he said, and his voice carried the particular tone of a man who had worked very hard to arrive at that true statement and had managed it. She wanted a different life. "I was not offering the right one." "What are you offering now?" Celia asked. He looked at her, the lantern light warm on his face. "I am still working that out," he said. "But I think I know more about what I want than I did 5 years ago." "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Something real, something with roots in it, work that means something. A place that is mine not because I am passing through it but because I built it." She thought about her farmhouse on the edge of town, the quietness in it. She thought about Pepper the mule and the tin of money under the floorboard and the $22 a month, and the schoolroom full of young minds. She thought about the roof with its good cedar shingles, and the way 2 hammers had sounded in the cold morning air. "Those are good things to want," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was its first cousin, warmer and more private. "Yes," he said, "I think they are." The following week he stayed. She had half expected him to leave once he had seen the property, to go back to Caldwell or wherever the work was, to decide that 30 acres of South Kansas land was not worth the trouble. He stayed. He worked on the Heller property every day, visible from the South Road as she walked to the schoolhouse, the sound of hammer and saw occasionally carrying on the still morning air. He came by the schoolhouse on Wednesday with a question about whether she knew of any family in town who might want to purchase a small parcel of the Heller land. Because Henrietta had told him she would accept 20 acres sold separately if it helped resolve the price. And Celia thought of the Pryor family who had been trying to expand their kitchen garden into a proper vegetable operation and might want the South Strip. She told him about the Pryors and he thanked her and started to leave, and then stopped at the door and turned back and asked, with a directness that she had come to find characteristic of him, whether she would walk with him Sunday afternoon. Just a walk. He said it plainly. Just a walk if she was willing. She said yes. They walked the South Road in the Sunday afternoon light, which at this point in October was golden and slanted and brief, coming down through the cottonwoods at a low angle that turned everything it touched into something slightly more beautiful than it was at noon. He showed her the Heller property properly, walked her through the gate he had repaired and around the perimeter of the fields, pointing out what he saw there, the good south-facing slope for a kitchen garden, the solid stone foundation of the main house that would hold another 50 years, the well that had given clean water at 12 feet. She asked questions. She had always been someone who asked questions, and she did not stop on account of the possibility that it might seem unfeminine or forward, because she was 30 years old and a widow and a teacher, and she had left the age of worrying about such things somewhere behind her. He answered every question directly. When he did not know something he said so, which she noted with the particular approval of a teacher for honest admission of ignorance. The main house was in need of work. He was right about that. But the bones were sound. She walked through it with him, their boots loud on the dusty floor, and looked at the kitchen with its wide fireplace and the 2 front rooms and the staircase going up to the loft bedrooms, and thought about the way a house like this would feel with a fire in it and voices in it and the particular fullness that came from a life properly inhabited. She did not say any of this. She said, "The fireplace draw is good," and pressed the exterior wall and said, "Good solid timber framing." He watched her do this with an expression she could not entirely read. "You know about house construction?" he asked. "I know what Thomas taught me," she said, "and what I have taught myself since." They walked back along the South Road in the late afternoon light and talked about other things, about the books she used in the schoolroom, and whether the town would ever be able to afford a proper library, about the Pryor family and whether they would be interested in the parcel, about the winter coming, which in Kansas had a particular quality of serious intention. At the point where the South Road met the main street, she stopped and thanked him for the walk, and he held her gaze for a moment with that expression that was warmer than a smile and said he would very much like to do it again. She said that she would like that too. November came in cold and clear. He bought the property. She heard about it on a Monday morning when Mr. Butterworth mentioned it at the general store with the particular casualness of a man who considers property transactions interesting news, which in a town of Millhaven's size they absolutely were. Arthur Ashford had signed the deed on the Heller property, all 30 acres including the main house, at a price that Henrietta Heller pronounced satisfying and Arthur Ashford pronounced fair, and Henrietta had packed her things and moved in with her sister in Abilene, which had apparently been her plan all along. Agnes arrived at Celia's kitchen table with this news on Saturday morning, looking entirely too pleased with herself. "He is staying," Agnes said. "I know," Celia said. "That is a large step for a man who said he was only looking at the property." "People change their plans," Celia said. Agnes's eyebrow performed its characteristic assent. "What changed his plan, I wonder?" Celia poured the coffee and said nothing, but she was aware of the warmth in her own face, which was not from the stove. "He came by the schoolhouse on Thursday afternoon, after the students had gone, to ask if she knew a reliable supplier of timber in the area, because he needed to replace the siding on the east wall of the main house before winter made the work impossible." She gave him the name of the Dowell Mill on the North Creek Road, who she knew from the school board's purchasing records to be reliable and reasonably priced. He thanked her and did not immediately leave, which had become a pattern she had begun to recognize and that she had begun, if she was entirely honest with herself, to look forward to. "I need to ask you something," he said. She was stacking the afternoon's readers on the shelf, and she stopped with 2 books in her hands and looked at him. "I would like to take you to the dance at the Grange Hall on Saturday," he said. "Not a walk, a proper dance." She looked at him for a moment. The books were a comfortable weight in her hands. The schoolroom was quiet around them, the potbelly stove ticking as it cooled. "A proper dance," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is a different kind of occasion than a walk on the South Road." "I know that," he said. "I mean it to be." She set the books on the shelf, both of them precisely. She smoothed her skirt, which was a habit she had when she was organizing her thoughts. Then she said, "Yes, I would like that." The particular light in his face when she said it was something she carried home with her in the dark November evening, and held carefully. The way you hold something you are not yet entirely certain is yours to keep. The Grange Hall on Saturday was lit with oil lamps hung from the rafters and the heat of 30-odd people, and the smell of wood smoke and dried flowers, and the particular energy of a prairie community in the last quiet before winter closed in and made gathering hard. She arrived in her blue wool dress with Agnes, who deposited her near the door with an air of mission accomplished, and immediately went to speak with someone on the far side of the room. Arthur was there already. He had made an effort, she could see it, the hair trimmed, the coat brushed, the boots polished. He was talking with the Pryor brothers when she came in, and he saw her and said something quick to them and crossed the room without hesitation. "You look very well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." It was a simple exchange, and it contained considerable more feeling than the words themselves. They danced. She had not danced in over a year, and she had been slightly afraid that she would have forgotten how, but the fiddle was insistent, and his hand at her waist was firm and steady, and the steps came back immediately. The way body memory always outlasts the things the mind forgets. They danced twice in a row and then stood aside to catch their breath, and then danced a 3rd time, and she felt the whole evening as a kind of brightness, warm and specific. Between the 2nd and 3rd dance she saw Mrs. Turnbow, the wife of the grain merchant, watching them with an expression that was not unkind but was speculative, which meant that by Sunday morning there would be a general consensus in Millhaven that Celia Hawthorne and Arthur Ashford were a thing that was happening. She noted this, weighed whether it concerned her, and found that it did not. The town could have its observations. She had lived carefully and decently for 14 months, and she owed Millhaven a great many things, but she did not owe it the suppression of something that felt for the first time in a very long time like genuine happiness. On the walk home he held her arm, which was practical on the cold, uneven road, and at the point where the road forked, one direction toward her farmhouse and one toward the south road and his property, they stopped. He turned toward her, and in the cold, clear night air with the stars enormous overhead in the Kansas sky, he said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "I came to Millhaven because Henrietta asked me to look at the property," he said. "And I would have looked at it and left. I have looked at a dozen properties in 3 years and left every one of them." "What made this one different?" she asked. He looked at her. The moonlight was sufficient to see his face clearly, and what was in it was clear enough that her heart did a slow, careful turn inside her chest. "A woman on a rooftop," he said, "who had been doing it alone for 2 days and did not need any help but had the practical good sense to accept a second hammer when one was offered." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold air was sharp in her lungs, and the stars were very bright, and the whole dark Kansas prairie lay around them in all directions, immense and quiet and entirely indifferent to the small human business of falling in love. She reached up and straightened the lapel of his coat, which did not particularly need straightening, and said, "I am glad you offered it." He covered her hand with his, and they stood there for a moment in the cold and the moonlight, and then he walked her the rest of the way home, and at her door he held her hand and said good night, and went back toward the south road. She stood at her door in the cold for perhaps 30 seconds after he was out of sight, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table in the lamplight with her hands in her lap and felt, for the first time since the August that Thomas died, something she could only describe as forward-looking, not looking backward at what had been lost, looking forward at what might be. December came with the first real snow, and with it, the particular intimacy of a prairie winter that brings people into each other's warmth or separates them entirely. Arthur was working on the east wall of the house, fitting the new siding against the cold, and sometimes she stopped on her walk to school to see the progress, and he would come down from wherever he was working, and they would talk for 10 minutes in the cold, breath visible in the air between them, and she would continue on to the schoolhouse feeling warmer than the temperature accounted for. He came to church on Sundays, not something he had been in the habit of in previous years. She gathered from Henrietta's correspondence that Agnes had been enlisted to relay, but something he was finding he wanted to do in a place where community was real and present, and built by hand the same as everything else. He sat 2 rows back from her, which was proper and also meant she could feel his presence at her back throughout the service with an awareness that was not wholly spiritual. The Saturday before Christmas, he came to her farmhouse door for the first time. He had a bundle of firewood from the Caldwell mill, a practical gift, the kind that was needed and useful, and said something about the kind of attention he paid. She invited him in for coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table where she had sat alone through 14 months of evenings, and the room felt different with him in it, not smaller but larger somehow, as if his presence was not an imposition on the space but an expansion of it. He met Pepper through the kitchen window. The mule pressed his long gray face against the glass with an expression of profound inquiry, and Arthur looked at him and then at Celia and said, "Does he do that often?" "Every time I have a visitor," she said. "He is nosy." "I appreciate that in an animal," Arthur said, and Pepper seemed to sense the approval because he stayed at the window for the next 20 minutes. They talked through the afternoon and into the early dark of the short December day, and the conversation moved over landscape they had not yet covered: her childhood in Illinois, the family she had not been back to see since coming west, the brother who had stayed on the family farm, and the sister who had married a schoolteacher in Springfield. His three brothers, one of whom had a ranch in Colorado now, one who ran a hardware store in Wichita, and one who had gone north to Wyoming, and about whom the family received periodic and often alarming letters. He laughed telling her about the Wyoming brother, a real laugh, unguarded, and she found that she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to see what he looked like when he laughed without reservation. He looked like someone she very much wanted to know better. When the dark had come fully in and she had lit the lamp, he stood to go, and at the door he turned and said, with the directness she had come to think of as quintessentially his, "I would like to court you properly, Celia. Not just walks and dances and firewood. I mean to be straightforward about my intentions." She looked at him in the lamplight from the open door. The cold came in around him. "Your intentions," she said. "I am 32 years old," he said. "I have been through enough to know what matters. I am not looking for company or convenience. I am looking for a partner, a real one, for a life that is built properly." He held her gaze. "I think you may be the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I think that before this year is out I would like to know if you might one day agree with me about the value of what I am trying to build." The cold air between them was very still. In the paddock Pepper made a low sound, which she chose to interpret as encouragement. "I think," she said carefully, "that I am already in considerable agreement with the general premise. And I think that a proper courtship with honest intentions is exactly the right approach." His expression did what it did when she said yes to things that mattered to him, that quiet warmth settling into his face like the answer to a question he had been asking for some time. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. She watched him walk toward the south road in the cold December dark, and then she closed the door against the winter and leaned back against it for a moment with her eyes shut, feeling the warmth of the kitchen and the warmth of the conversation and the warm, spreading, entirely serious thing that was happening in her chest. She pressed her bruised thumb, the one from the nail on the schoolhouse roof, which had healed weeks ago and only ached now when the cold was sharp. She pressed it and thought about the morning on the roof when she had heard boots on the ground below and looked down and seen a man she did not know holding a hammer with the clear and simple intention of offering it. She thought, the bones were sound. January was the deep cold of the Kansas winter, the kind that set in after Christmas and stayed for 2 months, and the courtship, as they had both called it with equal gravity, continued through it in the particular way that life continues on the frontier regardless of temperature, not paused by winter, but slowed to its essential elements, to evenings by fires, to meals shared, to long conversations in the warm kitchen after the short, brutal cold of the walk between their properties. He took to having dinner with her on Friday evenings, which began as a practical arrangement on his part. He had been eating his own cooking for 2 months, and she was a considerably better cook than he was, and became something else entirely, a ritual, a fixed point in the week that they both moved toward from Monday onward with a low, steady sense of anticipation. She learned him through those evenings. She learned that he was a man who read, which surprised her until she thought about it, and then did not surprise her at all because men who had spent long periods alone in open country tended to either drink or read, and he had the constitution for reading. He read history and natural science, and occasionally, he admitted with some slight embarrassment, novels. She found this entirely endearing and told him so, and then lent him the copy of Mr. Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd that she had been keeping on her shelf since a traveling bookseller had come through town the previous spring, and he read it in 3 days, and came back with a look on his face that she recognized as having been affected by something, and didn't want to say so directly. She asked what he thought of it, and he said that he thought Gabriel Oak deserved better than Bathsheba Everdeen for most of the book, and she said that that was exactly right, but that the point was the kind of patient devotion that waits for the other person to become who they need to be, and he gave her a long look and said, "Yes, I understand that." She understood, quite clearly, that they were no longer entirely talking about the book. He met her students in February, when the school board asked all available community members to attend the winter exhibition, where the children presented their learning to the town. He sat in the back row with Agnes and Reverend Munn and the Pryor brothers and watched her students stand at the front of the room and recite and draw on the chalkboard and read aloud. And afterward, when the parents were gathering their children and she was straightening the room, he came to stand beside her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen before. "They all look at you the same way," he said. She looked at him. "What way?" "Like you are the fixed point," he said. "The thing that doesn't shift." She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to be someone's fixed point, and then she looked at him and thought that perhaps that was something that could work in more than one direction. In March, the snow began to ease, and the light came back longer each day, and the prairie that had been brown and gray and dormant began to show the first faint green at its edges. It was the kind of spring that felt like a promise being kept. He came to dinner on a Friday evening in the second week of March, and after dinner, when she had put the coffee on and come back to the table, he reached into his coat pocket and set a small object on the table between them. It was a ring. A simple one, plain gold, without ornamentation, the kind that said what it meant without elaboration. "I have been thinking about this since December," he said. "I did not want to rush it. You have been through a great deal, and the last thing you need is a man who moves faster than the situation warrants." He looked at her directly, as he always looked at her, as if what she actually thought was the most important information in the room. "But I believe we have been honest with each other from the beginning, and I do not see any value in being less honest now." She looked at the ring on the table. She thought about the roof in October, the gap in the cedar shingles and the cold air and the raw hands. She thought about the sound of a second hammer joining hers. She thought about the months since, the way he had placed himself in her life with the same care he gave to every practical task, the way the quietness of her house had changed in quality since he had become part of filling it. She thought about Thomas, because she owed him that, and she thought about him with love and with grief, and with the understanding she had come to over these past months that grief and new love are not opposites, that they are different rooms in the same house, and that a heart large enough to have loved well once is large enough to choose well again. "Celia," Arthur said, and his voice was steady, but she could hear the current beneath the steadiness, the genuine uncertainty of a man who knows that what he wants most is something another person has to choose to give. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. "Yes," she said. The breath that went out of him was long, and she heard everything in it. The months of careful patience, the wanting, the particular relief of a man who has been asking a question he could not be certain of the answer to. He rose from his chair and she rose from hers, and he came around the table and stood before her in the lamplight kitchen and took her hands in his, the ring between them, and looked at her with an expression so full of what it was that she felt it land in the center of her chest and settle there like something that had always been meant to come home. He kissed her then. Not tentatively, not performed, but honestly, the way he did all things, directly and with his whole intention in it, and she kissed him back the same way, because she had not been made for anything else. They were married in May, at the Millhaven Church, with Reverend Munn officiating and Agnes Pratt weeping with satisfaction in the front pew, and the Pryor brothers in their good shirts, and the Morrison twins in disagreement over which side of the aisle they should stand on, and all 22 students from the schoolhouse seated in a row with their scrubbed faces and their best behavior, and inevitably, one of the Hennessy boys making trouble at the back. She wore the blue wool dress because it was still her best, and he wore a coat she had not seen before, properly tailored, which she suspected he had purchased from the dry goods store in the county seat, and which fit him very well. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk up the aisle with an expression that was going to stay in her memory for the rest of her life. Agnes had placed wildflowers from the creek bottom in every available surface of the church, which was Agnes's way of doing things with conviction, and the morning light came through the south windows, and the whole room smelled of spring. Reverend Munn spoke about partnership and about the particular courage of beginning again, and she held Arthur's hands through all of it and felt the weight of the ring she had been wearing for 2 months. Simple and plain and exactly right. They moved her things to the Heller property, which was no longer the Heller property, but was now their property. Over the course of a weekend, with the Pryor brothers helping with the heavy furniture and Agnes supervising, and Pepper the mule expressing his opinions from the paddock. The farmhouse she had lived in for 6 years, she let to a young family newly arrived from Missouri, a couple named Garrett and Lena with 2 small children, and the particular wide-eyed intensity of people who have staked everything on a new place and need it to work. She told them the roof was sound, and the well was reliable, and the soil on the west side took vegetables well, and Lena Garrett gripped her hand with both of hers and said thank you in a way that meant considerably more than the words. She kept her teaching post, which had never been in question as far as she was concerned, and Arthur kept his land, which he had begun to work in earnest through the spring, turning the south field to grain and starting a kitchen garden in the spot she had noted on their first walk of the property. He hired a hand for the heavy work of the summer, a quiet young man named Charlie Dewey, who had come up from Dodge City looking for steady work, and who turned out to have a gift with horses, and a disposition entirely suited to the rhythms of a working farm. The house, which Arthur had been repairing through the winter, was whole now. The east wall with its new siding, the repaired porch, the kitchen with its wide fireplace that she made immediate and personal by filling the shelves above it with her books, and the window sill with her seeds in jars, and the table with the things they had begun accumulating together, the things that have no significance individually but become the record of a shared life. She cooked in that kitchen, and he came in from the fields and sat at the table, and they ate together and talked, and sometimes in the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the prairie dark come in, and the stars appear over the flat Kansas horizon, and she felt the quietness of those evenings as entirely different from the quietness she had known before. Not the absence of something, but the presence of a different kind of fullness. The summer was hot and hard and productive. The grain came in well, and Arthur sold 2/3 of it and kept 1/3 for feed, and put the money toward the barn roof, which had the same quality of honest aging that the schoolhouse roof had had, more weathered than damaged, needing attention before it became something worse. He fixed it himself over 3 days in July, and on the second day she climbed up with him and handed nails and passed shingles, and he looked at her on his roof with the same quality of amusement and warmth that he had looked at her with on the schoolhouse roof, though the circumstances were considerably different now. "You know," she said, sitting back on the ridge with the July sun full on her face and the prairie spread out in every direction, green and wide and alive under the summer sky, "I was perfectly capable of doing the schoolhouse roof myself." "I know that," he said. He was fitting a shingle with the same deliberate care he always used. "You were 2 days in when I arrived." "I was managing perfectly well," she said. He drove a nail. Then he looked at her with those dark eyes that she had come to know in all their expressions. "Yes," he said, "you were." He looked back at the work. "I am very glad you let me help anyway." She thought about that, about what it meant to be capable of a thing and still choose to let someone help, not from weakness but from the understanding that sharing the work was its own kind of thing, separate from need, rooted in something more generous than necessity. "So am I," she said. She discovered in August that she was with child. She told Arthur on a Thursday evening in the kitchen after dinner, while the dishes were on the table and the lamp was lit, and the last of the summer light was still faint at the windows. She told him simply and directly, the way she told him everything, and watched his face do something she had never seen it do before, which was a complete and unguarded opening, every composed thing about him briefly absent, and what was there in its place was joy so pure it had no name for it except that. He came around the table and took her face in his hands with a gentleness she felt from her face down to her feet and said, "Celia," just her name, just that. But the way he said it contained everything he felt, and she felt it all. She pressed her hands over his, and they stayed like that in the lamplight kitchen for a long moment. Agnes, when told on Saturday morning, wept directly and without apology, and said she had known since October that this was where the roof was leading, which was an interpretation Celia did not entirely accept, but did not argue with because Agnes was in this case both correct and deeply happy, and those two conditions together deserved to be left undisturbed. The school year resumed in September, and she taught through the autumn with the particular energy that comes from a life abundantly full. And the students noticed something different in their teacher, though none of them would have been able to say what. Only that she smiled more often, and that even the Hennessy boys found it harder to truly vex her. She told the students about the baby in November simply as a fact of classroom life, because they would have noticed soon enough, and because she believed in telling children the truth as often as possible. They received the news with the range of responses she might have expected. The girls were immediately and enormously invested. The boys were briefly interested and then returned to their particular concerns. And little Dorry Caldwell, who had overcome her cough through a heroic course of rest and honey tea, put her small hand on Celia's and said with complete gravity, "I hope it is a girl." "We shall see," Celia said. Arthur finished the second bedroom in December, a project he had been working on in the evening since August, and she stood in the doorway of it on the day he finished and looked at the plain walls and the clean floor and the window that faced the south field and thought about all the things a room like this could hold. "It needs paint," he said behind her. "Spring," she said. "Yellow, I think." "Yellow," he said. "Yellow is a good color for a room that gets morning sun." He put his hands on her shoulders from behind, and they stood in the doorway of the future room and looked at it together. The baby came in the late February cold, which was not the most convenient time, but babies have their own sense of occasion. Agnes Pratt was there, which had been agreed upon months earlier, and the doctor from the county seat who had ridden in through the snow, and Arthur, who stayed close throughout, and whose steadiness was the kind that comes from a man who has decided that what is happening is the most important thing he has ever been present for, and he means to be fully present for it. It was a boy. He came into the world with the robust opinions of someone who has a great deal to say about the matter, and Arthur held him in the kitchen lamplight in the deep winter silence, and looked down at him with an expression that Celia, watching from the bed, thought was the most completely human thing she had ever seen on any face. "Thomas," Arthur said, and looked at her. She had not asked him to choose the name. He had arrived at it himself, and offered it as a question, his eyes asking whether it was right. "Thomas Arthur Ashford," she said. He nodded carefully, holding the very new person in his arms with the practiced solidity of someone who has decided that nothing in this room will be anything but protected. Agnes Pratt, who was pretending to be busy at the other side of the room, made a sound that she passed off as a cough, and that convinced no one. Thomas Arthur Ashford was a winter baby who grew into a spring child, who by April was making known his views on breakfast with considerable passion, who by May had the dark eyes of his father and the stubborn chin of his mother, and the entire opinion of Agnes Pratt that he was the finest child produced in Millhaven since records were kept. She went back to teaching in April, with Agnes minding Thomas in the mornings and Arthur arranging his farm work to be close to the house in the afternoons, which was the kind of logistics that required good faith and flexible planning, and the particular grace of a partnership where both people genuinely wanted the other's work to matter. The schoolhouse roof held. She looked at it every morning on the way in, and it remained solid and sound. The cedar shingles weathered now after 2 years from their pale raw color to the silver gray of properly aged wood. She thought about the October morning that had started it all, the climb up the borrowed ladder with the canvas bag of nails and the jaw set against the wind. She thought about the sound of boots on the ground below and the voice that said, without preamble or pretense, "I thought you might need a second hammer." She taught that year with Thomas in the back of the room in his basket some mornings when Agnes had her own obligations, and the students treated this arrangement with the solemn privilege it represented, each of them taking their turn to rock the basket when he fussed, competing quietly for the distinction of being the one who settled him. Even the Hennessy boys were reformed in the presence of an infant, which she filed away as a useful educational discovery. In the summer of 1884, the school board, which had been a source of opinions and short funding for the 3 years of her tenure, finally approved the budget for a second reader and a proper set of arithmetic slates, victories that she marked with the same satisfaction she gave to all work done well. Arthur's farm had become, by the end of that second year, a real going concern. The grain, the kitchen garden, 2 milk cows that Charlie Dewey managed with his characteristic quiet expertise, and a small orchard of apple trees planted along the south fence that would not bear fruit for 2 more years but were growing with purpose in the Kansas soil. He bought a second mule in the fall, not to replace Pepper, who was not going anywhere, but to pair with him for the heavier field work, and named the new mule Cedar because Arthur Ashford had a streak of dry sentiment in him that he generally kept covered, but that came out in things like mule names. She asked him why Cedar. He gave her the quiet look. "Because it is what I think of when I think about the first good thing that happened to me in Millhaven," he said. "The smell of new cedar shingles in cold October air." She had no available response to this that was adequate to the weight of the sentiment it expressed, so she kissed him instead, which he seemed to accept as entirely sufficient. The October of 1884 was the second anniversary of the roof, though they did not mark it as such formally. She was simply aware of it on a morning when the October wind came off the prairie with that same cold, insistent push, and she stood in the schoolhouse yard looking up at the cedar shingles, silver now with 2 years of weather, and thought about what had been started on that ladder with a canvas bag and a sore thumb, and a refusal to wait for help that no one was offering. What had been started was this: a classroom of children who came to her each day with their open faces and their questions. A farm on the South Road with sound bones and a good well, and an apple orchard that would bear fruit in a year. A man who did things with his whole attention, and who kissed her good morning before he went out to the fields with the same quality of intention he brought to everything. A baby who would be walking by Christmas and whose first word, it was privately suspected by both parents, was going to be Pepper, because the mule had made himself the child's particular fascination. Thomas Arthur Ashford did in fact say Pepper as his first comprehensible word, at 10 months old, pointing at the paddock fence with the imperious certainty of a child who knows the name of the most important thing. Arthur looked at Celia with an expression that was half offense and half helpless amusement and said, "After everything." "You named a mule Cedar," she said. "I feel this is balanced." He laughed. The full laugh, unguarded, the one she had first seen at her kitchen table in December of 1882 when he was talking about his Wyoming brother, and it was still, every time, the best sound in whatever room it was in. They stood in the paddock in the October morning with Thomas on Arthur's hip and Pepper pressing his long gray face against the fence rail with profound satisfaction at the recognition, and the whole sweep of the Kansas prairie around them in the wide blue October light, and the schoolhouse visible at the edge of the main street where the cedar shingles caught the sun and held it. The schoolhouse was fully repaired. The roof was sound. The bones were right. Everything she had built here, the teaching, the life, the love that had arrived on a second day with a second hammer, and a directness she had been grateful for every day since, was right in the bones, built to hold, built to last, built the way things should be built when the person building them knows that what they are making matters. She leaned against her husband's shoulder in the cool October light and felt the weight of her son on his other arm and the warmth of the man she had chosen who had chosen her, and the wide open country all around them that had asked everything of them and given everything back. The roof held. The farm grew. The school continued. The 2 mules, one gray and ancient and knowing, one younger, and named for the smell of good honest work, stood at the fence together as the seasons turned. And in the kitchen on Friday evenings there were two voices, and then three, and eventually more, filling the quiet that had once been only hers, filling it so completely and so warmly that on the rare occasions when the house happened to be still, the quietness itself felt different. Not an absence, not a wait, but a rest, a breath, the brief and necessary pause between one good thing and the next. She had climbed that roof alone because no one was offering to help, and there was a job that needed doing. She had accepted the help when it was offered because she was practical, and because the job was real and there was no virtue in refusing a good hammer. She had not expected the rest of it. She had not expected to find, in the counterpoint of two hammers in October cold, the opening notes of something that would fill the rest of her life with its music. But there it was. There it was.